and welcome everyone. It's my great pleasure to host the third in our Project Swallowtail fall webinar series. And tonight we are exploring invasive species and how to manage them in the garden. So what's wrong with garlic mustard is our title, and we have the wonderful Colleen Cirillo as our presenter. So of course, Project Swallowtail is a wonderful initiative, a collaborative initiative from several different groups in West Toronto that include Pollinator Partnership Canada, World Wildlife Fund Canada, the David Suzuki Foundation, the Parkdale and Toronto Horticultural Societies, the High Park Nature Stewards, and many others, as well as the expert advice of Lorraine Johnson, Pete Euonymus, and Colleen Cirillo, tonight's presenter. So many of you who are attending might be Project Swallowtail participants, block ambassadors. If you aren't and you're curious to find more about the project, please visit our website, projectswallowtail.ca. And if you are in our project area, we would love for you to join us. And if you aren't, please just keep an eye on it. Our Facebook group is pretty active and is open to everyone, and we'd welcome your participation there too. My name is Kathleen Law. I'm the Integrated Conservation Manager for Pollinator Partnership Canada, based in Toronto, and we also have offices in British Columbia, as well as the Northwest Territories. And of course, our presenter tonight, as I've mentioned, is Colleen Cirillo. So Colleen is a nature educator and invasive species specialist. Colleen has worked with the Toronto Region Conservation Authority. She's worked with Ontario Nature. She was the Director of Education at Toronto Botanical Gardens, where she worked for 15 years. Colleen really is an expert and a veteran in the topic, and she also sits on the board of the Ontario Invasive Species Council. And so she's with us tonight in those capacities mostly, but it's also important to note that Colleen is also the volunteer coordinator for Project Swallowtail. So a lot of you will have interacted with her through our email account or through our Facebook group. And Colleen is also a block ambassador with Project Swallowtail. So many of you will have seen her up and down her street, sharing plants, sharing advice with a trowel in hand. And you can always contact her at admin@projectswallowtail.ca. So Colleen will present for about 40 minutes, and then we'll reserve some time for question and answer periods. So any questions you have that come up during the presentation, please just put them in the Q&A box and we'll keep them for the end. So take it away, Colleen.
Thank you. Okay, can everyone see my slides? I hope you can. The title is What's Wrong with Garlic Mustard? Invasive Plants in the Garden. And we have a picture here of garlic mustard and dog-strangling vine. And I'm not sure of everyone's awareness of invasive plants. So I'm going to start off with some pretty basic terminology. And then we'll talk about control and a little bit about the history of these plants in this new range. And I'm going to try really, really hard to keep to 40 minutes. There's so much we could talk about, but I'm going to do my best to stay at 40 minutes. This is the content, and sometimes I just have a pretty picture in there that's not really relevant. This is a native plant, the gorgeous winter. It's the holly, the winterberry holly. It's a native, which is wonderful. And that picture was taken at the Trillium Park by the old Ontario place. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that spot, but you can go and see all sorts of native plants there. So back to the content, we're going to define native, non-native, and invasive plants. We're going to talk about horticulture as a pathway for invasive plants, and then move on to some of the typical garden plants that are invasive and alternatives to them. Then talk about the uninvited ones like garlic mustard and dog-strangling vine. You aren't bringing them into your garden, but they're showing up anyway. We'll get into the nitty-gritty of reporting, controlling, and disposal. And disposal is ridiculously contentious. Even, I've been in this field forever, and people are always still talking about disposal. And then I wanted to end on a bit of a high because I tend to give these invasive species talks, which can be quite heavy. And so I thought I would show you some pretty pictures of my garden and other people's gardens and talk about the new type of gardening that we should all be participating in. So let's start with the basics, native plants. Native plants are simply plants that have been here for millennia, and they've evolved along with other native plants, native animals, fungi, and bacteria in the presence of our native soils and our native climate. And they have connections just like any community members do. So they're very much connected, especially to insects. And that is the key thing that we're going to talk about during this presentation, the connection that is often specialized between native plants and native insects. So they provide food, habitat, shelter, nesting material for all of the lovely little insects, birds, mammals, amphibians, and reptiles that we love so much. Despite their beauty and their ecological importance, native plants are kind of hard to come by. They're not common in conventional nurseries, in big box stores, and for a lot of gardeners, they aren't familiar with native plants. You have to kind of work at getting to know native plants. They're not the mainstream, not yet, but we're working on that. And the key thing is chemistry. Plants have chemicals in their leaves that prevent herbivores from eating them. So it's a defense mechanism. But because our native insects have evolved with native plants, they're able to combat some of these defense chemicals. So they, over time, recognize the certain plants that they can derive nourishment from and keep going back to those plants generation after generation after generation. The specialization example that is probably most familiar is that of the monarch butterfly and the milkweed plant, our native milkweed plants, that is. So here we see the 4 stages of a monarch life cycle: egg, caterpillar, and the beautiful chrysalis and the adult. The adult can derive nectar from all sorts of sources, but the caterpillar can only derive nourishment from milkweed, our native milkweed species, including common milkweed, swamp milkweed, and butterfly weed. So if we don't have these plants in our garden, we won't have these species. And specialization is really common with insects at the larva stage. In terms of Lepidoptera, it's a certain group of insects, moths and butterflies, it's their larvae that are often specialized. And the adults can get nourishment on many different plants. Now let's define non-native. Very simple, really. Plants that have come from somewhere else. And sometimes we bring them in purposefully, say for horticulture or for food. And sometimes we bring them in accidentally. Maybe seeds were in the pot of another plant. I'm also going to mention naturalized, because naturalized plants are also non-native, and they've become quite common here in our landscape, but they don't pose a serious or direct threat to native biodiversity. An example might be the dandelion. And now let's get to invasive plants. And pictured here is multiflora rose, which is a beautiful plant. And you see it all through the ravines, even though it wasn't planted there. So it's an invasive. So invasive plants are non-native plants that do cause negative impacts to native biodiversity, the economy, and/or society, including human health. I wanted to mention that there are watch lists, because these lists that exist, the invasive species list, for example, for Ontario, it is not a static list. It is changing all the time. Unfortunately, it's going in the wrong direction. It's a list that keeps increasing in length, because plants that may be non-native but non-invasive now might become invasive in time as we continue to mess up our environment, to change our landscape, to open up forests, to move into areas where we haven't been before. So you have to be careful with species that are non-native. If you see that they're already aggressive, you might want to really be careful about removing those from your garden, especially if you live near a natural area. Some examples of species that are on watch lists, you can find them in this little guide called Grow Me Instead. And at the back is a list of horticultural plants that will be very familiar to most of us who garden that are on the watch list, like butterfly bush, privet, creeping Euonymus, Japanese barberry. So these are ones that we also want to avoid, even though they're not yet classified as invasive. What makes a plant invasive? Well, there are all sorts of characteristics. You don't have to have every one of these, but you do have to have a few. And all the ones that we're going to talk about tonight do have these characteristics. Adaptability, so you can grow in a number of soil conditions and habitats with full sun, full shade, or something in between. And you come from a place that has a similar climate to us. Many of the invasive species in Ontario are from Asia, Japan or China or Europe, and their climatic conditions are similar, so the plant comes here and it does well. Lack of insect predators. So this goes back to that idea of the non-native plants being brand new to our native insects. Really, they've only been here for a blink of an eye in terms of all of time, of millennia. So our plants, our insects haven't adapted with them, evolved with them, and they can't consume them. So there are no herbivores keeping these plants in check. Now this one, prolific seed producers, this is a really important one, and I have some scary figures to share with you. So most of us are, or all of us are familiar with dog-strangling vine. And if you look at the research, it says that up to 2,400 seeds can be produced per square meter. Now that's scary enough. And then you think about how easily DSV seeds are dispersed. If you go into the ravines right now, you'll see all the pods opened up and the seed just spilling forth. Garlic mustard is another one that produces a tremendous amount of seed, and the figures there are really unbelievable. So plants can produce up to 150 seed pods, so one plant up to 150 seed pods, and each seed pod can contain up to 22 seeds. A dense population of garlic mustard can produce 60,000 seeds per square meter, and these seeds can live in the seed bank for up to 10 years. And you can find out more of this depressing information on the Invasive Species Center website, which is a tremendous resource. I would definitely recommend you go there, and I have the URL on one of my upcoming slides. So you can see, these are just two examples. I could go on, but prolific seed production it's a big reason why many of these plants are invasive. Vegetative spread, so the ground covers rely on their rapid vegetative spread, so that's the periwinkle, goutweed, and English ivy. Early to leaf out and late to drop leaves, think of Norway maple and buckthorn. They both are able to photosynthesize for longer than many of our natives because they have their leaves for longer. It also means that it degrades the beautiful color of fall in Ontario. And Ontario is known for its glorious fall color, but if our forests, our woodlots become filled with Norway maple and buckthorn, we will lose that glorious color. And the last one is really important. It's about the ability of a plant to change the environment to its benefit. So garlic mustard, as an example, is allelopathic, which means that its roots produce chemicals, including cyanide, that change the soil chemistry and prevent other species from growing around it. Some of these chemicals are also present in the leaves, which prevent herbivores from consuming them. This is an important point for people that want to remove garlic mustard and eventually plant native species. There are some researchers that are saying, first, what you really should do is amend the soil. And that way your native plants are going to have a better chance of surviving. DSV also changes the soil by increasing nitrogen levels, which makes it unsuitable for many of our native plants. And goutweed tissues contain chemical substances that apparently are antifungal. And if you know a little bit about plants, you've probably heard that many of them are associated with fungus, with mycorrhizal fungi, which is under the ground. And so if you lose that fungi, again, if you put in native plants, they will either not be successful or not as successful as you would like. So those are some examples. This is a picture of Russian olive. I put it in because when I started at Toronto Region Conservation Authority many, many moons ago, I'm not going to say because it'll tell you how old I am, we had lists that we handed out to homeowners suggesting they plant Russian olive because it produces fruit that the birds eat. And that's true, it does produce food for birds, but only as adult birds consuming fruit. It doesn't provide nourishment for baby birds. And as Talame mentions over and over again in his amazing book, Bringing Nature Home, which is my Bible, baby birds require high fat, high protein larvae. So that larva can be from sawflies, it can be from moths, from butterflies, but they need those juicy little worm-like critters to feed. The adults need those to feed to their babies, to make those babies be able to fledge and be successful. So you don't want Russian olives if you're interested in attracting birds. Global and regional impacts. So what are the impacts of invasive species? You can read that if you like. It's no surprise what you're going to find on this slide. Definitely invasive species, invasive plants I'm mostly focusing on tonight. But generally invasive species will degrade ecosystems and reduce native biodiversity. They also negatively impact different types of industry, including forestry and agriculture. They can also damage infrastructure. Consider Japanese knotweed, which is a huge problem in the UK, and you cannot sell your house unless you disclose that you have or recently had Japanese knotweed on your property. Ontario has the highest number of invasive plants, and that makes sense because we're so populous and we have many people coming and going, goods coming and going. We have 441 known invasive plants, and we're at the highest or greatest risk of more invasions. The bottom number there is quite shocking, and this is just for what governments spend on invasive species. So not just plants, but all species that exist in around the world. More than $1 trillion spent by governments worldwide managing, writing plans for invasive species. So this is a big problem, and it's not going to go away. In fact, it is likely going to get worse. Local impacts, again, crowding out native plants. And this is one that maybe you don't think of right away, but if you work in the ravines, and I've worked in the ravines a lot, erosion is a big issue, right? Because of the way we've built up our ravines and around our ravines, and because of the way, my cat wants on my table, because of the way our stormwater comes up in the ravines so quickly. So we have erosion problems, and garlic mustard, Norway maple, and DSV just increase those erosion problems. And as an example, think of garlic mustard. It has that S-shaped root, which is very different than the fibrous roots of many of our native ground cover plants. Also Norway maple, as you know, if you're a gardener trying to grow under it, has really dense shade, and that makes it difficult for species to grow underneath it. Degrade wildlife habitat. So there has been some research done at Michigan State University that shows how garlic mustard alters habitat quality for salamanders and mollusks through changes in the forest leaf litter, both the depth of the leaf litter and the composition of the leaf litter. And the same is the case for forest insects. So the presence of garlic mustard does definitely degrade habitat quality. What else? And it's just, as I mentioned before, it really does change the look of a natural area and of a garden. This is a picture of periwinkle. I am fighting periwinkle and goutweed and a few other invasives that are at this beautiful cottage that I get to visit regularly. So my in-laws' cottage. And I got myself a nice case of poison ivy rash trying to dig out the periwinkle. This is a quote from a 2012 plan from Ontario Invasive Species Strategy that just stresses how important it is to try and prevent the spread. Because once we have these invasive plants in our natural areas, it's almost impossible to remove them, and the ecological effects are quite dramatic. Now let's talk about horticulture as a pathway. And this is not about me trying to place blame on people. It's really just facing the fact that horticulture has been a very generous contributor of invasive plants, and that's a pretty well-established fact. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency, I should say, says that 50% of the known invasive plants in Canada have been introduced through horticulture. And research in the States shows that 82% of invasive trees and shrubs have come through horticulture. So we'll talk about this in the end when we talk about a garden revolution, that we can't garden like we did back in the 60s, or some of you, I wasn't born yet, but still, we can't garden like we used to. And horticulture can't continue the way it has been continuing. And that's not a bad thing, because to be part of the solution is a very hopeful thing. And what we can do is support the growers that are producing native plants. And there's a list of native plant growers on the North American Native Plant Society site. And we can call out the big box stores and the more conventional nurseries when they do sell invasives, goutweed, periwinkle, and others, without any kind of signage to warn people that they're invasive. I wanted to mention a little bit about research that has taken place in Delaware. A University of Delaware student who worked under Talame did a study of Carolina chickadees. So this isn't that chickadee, this is our black cap chickadee. Probably a little sawfly larva is in his claws, or her claws, as you can see. So back to the research. This student, she watched a bunch of nests in the spring, chickadee nests, and she watched the adults come and go, and then the adults left the nests. But she didn't see the chicks, or didn't see many chicks fledge. So when the nests had been abandoned, she went and she discovered a number of dead chicks and also non-food items that the adults had brought brought to the nests in an effort to feed their chicks. And there were pieces of garbage or other insects with hard shells. They were unable to find the high-fat, high-protein, soft insects that are required for them to make it through those early days. Talame in his book estimates that one clutch of chickadees, so that's 4 to 6 birds, will gobble up more than 9,000 caterpillars in 16 days between hatching and fledging. So he always says that we should garden for caterpillars, and that's definitely something that I would recommend. I wanted to mention a bit of local research as well that relates to non-native and native plants. And this research was inspired by Talame, and it was done by Eric Davies, who's a U of T PhD student. And he did this research maybe 5 or so years ago for his PhD. And it examined the use of trees, non-native and native, by birds, and the abundance of insects. He set up traps in, say, Norway maples and then our native maples. He had sites throughout Toronto. One of them was the Mount Pleasant Cemetery, which has gorgeous trees. And he then had some younger students help him, and they looked for the birds, bird activity in the trees. So how many birds go into the trees and how long they stay. And over, they would see the same thing, that the birds would go into, say, the non-native Norway maple, and they would very quickly come out. And then some birds would go into the native maples, and they would stay for quite a long time. So then they looked at the insect traps, and they found that the native trees held many more insects and a greater diversity of insects than the non-native trees. So if you want to learn more about Eric Davies' research, his website is still up and it has a little bit of information, and he's also a great person to talk to. So ericdavies.ca is his website. Wanted to mention this great project that I've worked on for many years. Well, I think it's great, and I hope you will too. It's called Grow Me Instead. I'm holding up, I don't know where my camera is, the 3rd edition that was just completed this year. And you can find all the latest edition on the website on the slide. So this is a picture of our old guides, and the newest one is the best yet, I would say. So this little guide has really, it's the most popular project of our group, which is the Horticulture Outreach Collaborative. And the idea is to bring ecologists and horticulturalists together to solve our common problems and work towards common goals. So I definitely would recommend that you take a look at it. And then the next couple slides are gonna demonstrate how it works. So in the guide, we present the problem species, the species that we don't recommend, the species we recommend you remove or at least control their spread. So in the case of ground covers, we have periwinkle, goutweed, and ivy mentioned. And then we suggest alternatives that are, say, the same height or the same thickness of vegetation, denseness of vegetation, and they'll do well in the same kind of environment. So that's how that guide works. So most people find it quite helpful. We can talk a little bit about the control of these 3 ground covers now, and then we'll do a little summary of control later on. Just going to check the time. So these are all going to spread vegetatively. So it's good to know how the species spreads to help you determine which control method to use. With periwinkle, people recommend you build a bit of a trench, dig a bit of a trench between where, at the edges of the invasion, if you can, and then dig it up as much as possible and be vigilant. I'm going to say that about 100 times today, but be super vigilant. And then at the cottage, what I did after I pulled it out was I covered the area. And it kind of broke my heart to cover the area because I knew that I had some native plants there, including trilliums, and who wants to kill trilliums? But I know how aggressive periwinkle is. So I dug it out as much as I could, and I put down these big planks of wood and then a bunch of leaf mulch on top. And I'm going to leave those in place probably for a full year and then check on the invasion. So pull and cover is a good option for periwinkle if you can. For English ivy, I actually don't have experience pulling it out, but there are different things you can do, like the digging, and also I've heard some people try mowing it. But what I heard was most successful by the couple of people I asked, and when I looked online to verify, was to cut it and then cut the roots as much as possible and roll it like a carpet out of the way, off the site, dispose of it, and then cover the area if you can. Again, ugly, but you could put some leaf mulch on top. If you don't want to cover it, you at least just be very vigilant for any rootlets that were left behind that start to sprout. Now, if you have ivy growing up trees and you want to get rid of it, you could try cutting the stump, putting duct tape around the stump. Duct tape, you know, it solves everything. Having the duct tape come up a little bit, putting salt on the stump, and then a little bit of water and leaving it for a few months, and that should kill the stump. And that's another option you could try. I am not going to be talking about herbicides because I have never applied herbicides, nor have I ever brought anyone in to apply herbicides. So I really don't feel like I can speak to them. And most of us probably aren't comfortable using herbicides and don't need them for our small gardens. So I'm going to talk mainly about mechanical, and I'll touch briefly on biocontrol. And the other one I wanted to mention was goutweed. And that big picture is of goutweed in a ravine in Toronto. And that breaks the heart of any ecologist or naturalist. Look at that monoculture of goutweed. It often turns to that solid green when it's naturalized or when it's gone into a ravine, but we often see it as variegated. So this is a pain to get rid of. Anyone who's tried to get rid of goutweed probably knows this. The stewards in the ravines. So stewards are people that volunteer in the ravines to take care of certain areas. And I'm helping them with some manuals right now. So we were talking about goutweed, and what a number of them are trying is mowing the goutweed at the very start of the spring. And that's because of the way goutweed grows. It apparently accumulates a bunch of carbohydrates, and there's a big burst of use of those carbohydrates at the start of the spring. So if you cut down the leaves at the start of the spring, you kind of kill back the plant. Now, some stewards are saying that mowing early on works, and some are saying it doesn't. So I'm not quite sure. I, at the cottage, where I have attempted to get rid of it, I have just covered it because digging it out, I've never had success. I just can't get all the roots. And these 3 and other ground cover invasives, if you leave a little bit of root, they're going to keep coming back. So you could try that. Basically try to deplete the carbohydrate reserve by an early mowing, and you might want to follow up with another mow if you see it coming up again, if you don't want to put down a tarp or black plastic or something to cover. These are some great alternatives. There's so many we could mention. Look at that beautiful wild geranium, and we have canna anemone, oh my gosh, mayapple, and wild strawberry there. So there are so many beautiful natives that are alternatives. They're just not that common in nurseries or in gardens. I'm probably speaking to the converted here, but I know when I talk to my friends and family, they haven't heard of these plants, which is such a shame because of their beauty and because of their ecological importance. Let's go move on to some woody species. And here's one that is getting a lot of attention right now. It is a gorgeous tree. It's the Euonymus, winged Euonymus. And I was down in the Humber Valley on the weekend, and it kind of broke my heart because everybody was posing for pictures in front of winged Euonymus. And I don't know, there's so many beautiful natives that we should be posing in front of, right? So it got its name because of its beautiful color. It's an adaptable plant, so it was brought over to be used in gardens in the 1860s. It's from Eurasia. And what else can we say about it? Its invasive tendencies. It is a prolific seed producer, and birds will take and move that seed. So this is all over our ravines. I used to work at the Toronto Botanical Gardens, and Edwards Gardens and the Toronto Botanical Gardens have a lot of this. And you could see the seedlings all through Wilkett Creek Ravine, just adjacent to the manicured gardens. In High Park, you can see it right now. Again, because it's so red, it's easy to see. And you can also, once the leaves are gone, you can identify it by the corky wings on the bark, on the twigs. So if it's small, you could try digging it out. If it's really big, you might want to try girdling it, and then it will die in maybe a year. And you still have to, at some point, probably remove the root system. Some alternatives, well, how could I not mention my absolute favorite species of all times, the Serviceberry. Gorgeous fall color, as you can see at the bottom of the slide. But you also get spring flowers and then fruit at the beginning of the summer that is nutritious and edible. Another one which I don't have a picture of, which is a super great alternative to mention for burning bush, is chokeberry. Beautiful flowers in the spring, more edible berries, and gorgeous color in the fall. So they're both mentioned in the Grow Me Instead guide, and I would definitely recommend those as alternatives for burning bush. Norway maple, I'm not going to go through all these numbers, but about 10 years ago, a number of municipalities within Southern Ontario did these studies, eye tree studies. So they surveyed their urban forests. What did they find? Well, all sorts of interesting things, including how very prevalent Norway maple is. So you can see it was #1 for open space and for natural cover areas. And just think about that for a minute. We don't plant Norway maple in natural areas. And yet in 2009, it was the #1 tree. Why is that? Because it is such a prolific seed producer, and because it creates an environment that makes it difficult for our natives to survive and to germinate, even if the seed is there. So here we have a picture of the bark and the leaf and the seed, the samara there, which is almost a 180 degrees. So that's an easy way to identify Norway maple. Norway maple, as I said, is a prolific seed producer. And in Toronto, where it's a big problem, the seeds travel through the storm drains, and they travel up the banks of our ravines and then take root along the ravine sides. So when we used to talk to people outside of Toronto about how invasive Norway maples are, they just didn't get it because their stormwater is managed differently, and maybe they don't have a lot of these street trees, Norway maple street trees. But we brought them to Toronto to tour the ravines. So these would be some of the growers, and we had a tour. This is when I was working for Toronto Region Conservation Authority, a tour of natural areas in urban areas. And I think it was quite eye-opening for some of them to see that it wasn't us just making this up. So many horticultural plants are in our natural areas, and they weren't planted there. They've escaped gardens. Quickly, I'll mention that there was U of T research done recently by Anki Dong, and her research received an award. So it's a fantastic study. She went back and looked at areas of the ravine studied 40 years ago by the Toronto field naturalists. She resurveyed those plots. Again, all sorts of interesting things were found, but the one I wanted to mention here was Norway maple more than doubled its prevalence since the 1970s. So many great alternatives to Norway maple, right? I don't know why we would ever plant this. And City of Toronto, I don't think they plant it anymore for their street trees, and it's certainly not on their plant list for homeowners to purchase trees. They can't choose Norway maple, thank goodness. Most of those trees that are being offered are native, not all of them, but most. Salome mentions oaks as being the #1, the most supportive tree or woody species or genus for Lepidoptera. So that's for the moths and butterflies for their larvae. So that is a beautiful picture there of a red oak. Look at that color. And then we also have a picture of a maple, because any of our native maples would do as a great alternative to Norway maple. And then down below we have the tulip tree, which is the larva host for one of the swallowtail butterflies. So definitely wanted to include that. Another great one that does well in the cities, it would be hackberry. Okay, let's move on, because I could see that I'm talking for too long. So for the uninvited invasive species. So quickly we'll go through garlic mustard. Garlic mustard is a prolific seed producer. So I really wouldn't recommend pulling it, even though I know I used to organize garlic mustard pulls, which makes me want to, you know, hide under a rock, because we probably did more damage than good, because we probably disturbed a lot of soil and just caused a lot more of the seed to germinate. So most people would say, if it's a small patch, try to dig it out and dig out all the roots you can. And then be really vigilant looking for the seedlings in years to come, or even later in that season. However, if you have a big area, you're not going to be able to pull it all out. So try cutting with minimal soil disturbance. So you want to cut at the base, just after flowering and before seeding, before the seeds come out, sorry. If by the end of the summer, by midsummer, you haven't gotten around to removing the plant, the most minimal thing you want to do is to remove the seed heads. Because even if you can't control it on your garden, be a good neighbor and stop it from spreading into other people's gardens. DSV, the picture of the seed heads, that's what I saw in the ravine 2 weeks ago when I was in the Humber Valley. And you see this all over High Park as well. Though the seed, another very prolific seed producer, dog-strangling vine, is easily spread by wind. And so that's what it's doing right now, because the seed heads were not collected. And so that's what's happening. We can't really do too much about it in the ravines other than really advocate for the city to put more money into control of invasive plants. But certainly on our properties, we can cut back the seed heads if we haven't cut the plants back earlier in the year. But definitely, if you want to be more aggressive about the removal, you can dig out the small patches. Small patches digging is viable. But if it's a big patch, you could try mowing at different stages or cutting and then mowing. But it is really tricky. And dog-strangling vine, the seed lasts for maybe 2-3 years in the soil. So aggressively going at this one, although it's going to be difficult, you could say to yourself, well, maybe I got to do this for 3 years, and then it's going to be good. Garlic mustard, the one we just talked about, that seed lasts for up to 10 years. So really, you want to be on stopping more seeds from being released is your #1 thing. And then you're going to have to be vigilant for 5 or so years. Now, I wanted to mention quickly biocontrol, which I know isn't really possible for homeowners, but it's kind of cool. After 10 years of study, the hypena moth was released into certain areas in Ontario. So a number of institutions like University of Toronto and University of Ottawa were participating in this biocontrol research and decided that after 10 years of study, the hypena moth would do more good than damage, and they released it, and the caterpillar of this moth consumes the leaves of dog-strangling vine. They made sure in their 10 years of studying this caterpillar that it does not, and it will not consume any of our native vegetation. So you can find out more about that plant, that insect, that biocontrol agent, by Googling hypena moth, Hypena. I'm sorry, I don't have a website for you, but it's kind of, when you look at the monocultures of dog-strangling vines, say in the Rouge Valley, I don't see how we can get at controlling this without a biocontrol. Although I know for a lot of people, they're still hesitant to accept it or to promote it. They think of the cane toad in Australia and all the other biocontrol agents that went badly. But this one I feel has been studied for a very long time. Unfortunately not available to homeowners. And let's move on to another one, buckthorn. So it's producing seed in the fall right now. Birds do consume buckthorn, but kind of as a last resort because it has a severe laxative effect, which is why they are so good at, or it gets spreads so easily. And you often see it under wires along roads because birds will sit on the wires, poop out the seed, and the seed will germinate. It is one that was first really discovered by hunters because the leaves remain until November. And so hunters were unable to have clear vision, clear sights. And so they started to call the Ministry of Natural Resources saying, this is many years ago, decades ago, saying, you know, there's this new shrub that's in our woodlots, what's going on? And so they were very involved originally in monitoring buckthorn, and they still are. The Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters does a lot for invasive species monitoring and control and education. The one picture there of the bird, that's from Ken Sproul, that picture, and that's a female bluebird in a buckthorn tree. So buckthorn, if you want to get rid of it, if it's small, you can try digging it out, roots and all. You could try also just cutting the stump. And the thing is, the stump will definitely resprout. Cities will put herbicide on top. And I wanted to mention quickly that there's a new treatment being tested in High Park. And it's a type of fungus. It's called controlled peat paste. And they still cut the buckthorn, but instead of putting a herbicide on, which is contentious, a lot of people don't like the idea of putting chemicals out into the environment, they're putting a naturally occurring fungus paste on the stump. And then they're hoping that that will stop the resprouting. It will take up to 2 years to determine if this is being successful. So we'll have to wait and see, but you can go to the High Park Nature website and learn more about that testing that's happening. Japanese knotweed. This one grows anywhere. As I mentioned before, in the UK, it's a big issue when you're selling your house. They tend not to have basements in their houses, and they have Japanese knotweed coming up through the bottom. It can do quite a bit of infrastructure damage. It spreads via rhizomes and root fragments, and it's found everywhere I go: stream banks, roadsides, fields, parks, gardens, cracks in pavement, and more I'm finding this up in cottage country, which is you know, really hard to see. So I took a picture of it in the alley where I live. I live on Galley Avenue, and that's it coming up in an alley, and it's all over the alleys. And then the other picture, the big picture, is of it flowering along the lakeshore. This one is really tricky to get rid of because you have to get rid of the roots, and they are extensive, and it's often coming up through concrete. So what are you going to do? Take out your whole concrete or all your asphalt? If you can't do that, some people, it actually says on a lot of the fact sheets and technical reports to resort to herbicides, to use herbicides, to inject the stems with herbicides. Again, I can't really speak to that because thankfully I don't have this on my property, although really it's all around me. So it's just a matter of time before it starts to show up, but I know to be vigilant and look for it. In the spring, what you want to look for is the asparagus-like spears that are coming up from the ground. Okay, reporting. You have two options here for reporting, and reporting is so very important. So our governments can see how extensive this problem is and how more and more people are aware of it and are demanding action. So you can download the Invasive Species, the EDD Maps Ontario Species app, or you can go to their hotline or their website to report. Another alternative is the iNaturalist app. And what's cool about iNaturalist, and so this is the one I'm doing now because I find it easier to use, and I know that all the data that I put in that relates to invasive species of any sort in Ontario will get uploaded, will get shared with the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forests. So you could just go with the one app and make sure, and then you will be covered for sure. Monitor invasive species. You really want to get to know the species at all stages, as I said. That way, when the spring comes, you know, if you start to see that glossy leaf coming up, and that's DSV or that asparagus-like thing coming up from the ground, that's Japanese knotweed, and you can get on the control right away when it's easiest. So this little booklet is found at the URL at the bottom of the slide, and I have it here. I wanted to say that I'm going to leave a bunch of resources that are related to this on my porch, and please feel free to come and pick it up, and I'll leave it there till Halloween, the box of supplies. So I'm at 30 Galley Avenue, and I have a bunch of the Grow Me Instead guides for anyone that's interested. Okay, so once you know that you have invasive plants in your garden, you're going to have to go back year and year. Vigilance, that's the key here. So put a marker in the ground so you know from year to year where to go and look. Yeah, so I think that's pretty self-explanatory. So we talked a lot about mechanical methods of control. I don't know much about chemicals, and I do hesitate, like a lot of us that are naturalists and ecologists, you know that non-target species are going to get hit by these, and so that's a big pill to swallow, but sometimes it might be necessary if you have a large property and a large infestation. And you would obviously have to contact the MOE, Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks to find out about licenses and permits. Different things to consider: the site, like the access to the site, the size of the site, the size of the invasion, presence of endangered or dangerous species. I told you that I got myself some nice poison ivy rash in the spring when I was trying to remove periwinkle. So just be conscious of that. Learn from my mistakes and wear gloves. Seems pretty basic, but apparently I don't learn. Time of year. So your control might change through time of year. Remember we talked about if you've, at certain times, you have a key opportunity to make a big impact, but if you've missed it, you've been away or you had other things going on, at least later in the summer or in the fall, remove the seed heads so that you're not spreading it around. Aesthetics, tarping can be really effective as an example, but it's ugly as hell. So do you really want to have a tarp out for a year or two? Many things to think about. That Invasive Species Center website, the URL that's at the bottom there, is fantastic. It has the Ontario Invasive Plant Council's best management practices. It has technical documents, fact sheets, and that center is always up on the latest science and adjusting its advice to people as new things become, new science tells us new things. If we learn stuff, you can guarantee that the resources are going to be updated. Disposal. So disposal, at the City of Toronto, they recommend that everything goes in the I'm running out of time, in the garbage. And that is because even though maybe you could be a little more flexible, a nuanced message is sometimes complicated. I think about the mask messaging that's happening now, and it would almost be better if everyone just always wore a mask, right? As opposed to changing advice. So if you're uncertain, please dump everything in the landfill, even though it is ridiculous to think that we're going to spend money and pollute and send our invasive plants far away. What I would say is the City of Toronto needs to have a better system, especially with all the stewards out there removing invasive plants. So you can advocate for the City of Toronto coming up with another alternative for people, what to do with invasive plants. You don't want to put them in your compost because it doesn't get hot enough, your backyard compost, to kill the seed. You don't want to leave them in your garden, especially the reproductive parts. You could leave, say, the stumps of your Norway maple or your buckthorn, and that should be just fine. Definitely don't dump them in natural areas. Yeah, so I'm going to leave it there, but definitely though, check out those BMPs, the best management practices. So a summary of our approach to invasive plants. Educate yourself on what these plants look like and which ones are in your neighborhood, which ones you should be looking out for. Share what you know, because we're all learning, this is all new for us, and so we can really help each other out. And I found that an organization that's really good about sharing everything that they're trying, like what works, what doesn't work, is the Credit Valley Conservation Authority. So you might want to check out their great work on invasive plants and work together with neighbors. Dealing with invasive plants, I know, because I've been doing it for many years, can feel crushing at times because it's such a big problem and in some ways quite neglected still by the people that can really make a difference. So definitely work with your neighbors. Be vigilant is the big thing. Keep looking out for these invasive plants on your property, even your neighbor's property, and have a conversation with them about working together to control them. Quick action is important. Report, use your consumer power to ask nurseries and big box stores to remove Norway maples, please, and barberry and all the other invasive or species even on the watch list, and to include more locally sourced, locally grown plants. And advocate for your governments to take action because there's so much action that needs to take place. So I wanted to end with a little bit of, well, I didn't want to be depressing the whole night. So I thought we could talk about really another vision for gardening, because we can't garden the way we used to, and the horticultural industry can't carry on the way it used to. And I think that there are people in that industry that already get that, and they are changing their ways. So I have right now just a few pictures from my garden and other people's gardens that I hope will inspire you. This is a quote from Douglas Tallama's book from 2007, Bringing Nature Home. In too many areas of our country, there is no place left for wildlife, but in the landscapes and gardens we ourselves create. So we can't rely on national parks and provincial parks to protect biodiversity. It's on all of us. And that's not like a bad thing. It's a wonderful thing. I can tell you that I have met the most beautiful people working in this field, and get absolute thrill of all the little critters that share, that are part of my community. So imagine visiting your favorite natural area where the sights and the sounds and the anticipation and the mysteries of nature bring you tremendous joy and a sense of connection. Now imagine not having to drive there, not having to pollute or to waste time in traffic, not having to spend money on gas, not having to spend money on an entrance fee. Sorry, let me just get back to my, I don't know why that's come up there. Okay. You can go to this place anytime you want. You can see the native species at all times of year, at all stages of life. You can become familiar with them just as you become familiar with other members of your community. You can get your regular dose of vitamin N for your physical and mental well-being, emotional well-being. This is what Tallamy proposes in his book, Bringing Nature Home, and it's what we're trying to accomplish as members of Project Swallowtail. It can seem like a lot of work. It can feel daunting, but the rewards are well worth the effort. The sights and the sounds of nature, but even more, the sense of hope and the community that you will gain. This is a quote from his most recent book. Millions of acres of lawn can be quickly restored to viable habitat by untrained citizens with minimal expense and without any costly changes to infrastructure. And I can tell you in the short time that I've been working on Project Swallowtail, this is basically what we're trying to do. And so we really hope that you will join us. And I thank you so much for your time, and I'm sorry I went over. Thank you.
Colleen, thank you so much. What a truly inspiring vision you've laid out for us, and illustrated with photos of these gardens, which already exist, this habitat that is already existing. And as you said, is part of a growing movement. I really like how in the early part of the presentation, when you were showing us that picture of that very sort of classic flower bed with the hostas and the daylily and all, and he said that we need to switch our plant choices, that it's not a bad thing, you know. It's really an opportunity to become part of a solution, and you've shown us with these last few slides what that can look like, and given us great options for alternatives to these invasive species. And I speak with experience, having to deal with Japanese knotweed and goutweed and garlic mustard and creeping bellwort and a Norway maple in my garden. So so we have some great questions lined up in the Q&A, so please keep them coming. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can. Abigail is saying that she loves the Grow Me Instead guides. They are a wonderful resource. And so I think those are fairly easy to find online, right? Colleen, people can just look for Grow Me Instead invasive species and they'll find it?
Yeah, on the Ontario Invasive Plant Council website, you can find it.
Wonderful. Okay, Pete's asking for goutweed. Oh, I'm interested in this. I found for small areas, a very thorough removal of all above and below ground growth is good, followed by a later repeat on what you missed. Do you think this is feasible if you have enough volunteers for a couple of years in a larger site like a ravine?
I wish we had some of the stewards on site. I think the problem, like, it's a bit challenging when you're a steward because one, you need to always get permission from the city, and two, you're not at your site every day like you are with your own garden. So it's a little bit trickier to be vigilant. But I think if you had the manpower and you had permission to go back and regularly remove, it could be. You've probably seen those extensive infestations in the ravines. Sometimes it's an entire slope. And so that would be tricky to remove just with manpower, human power.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And indeed, like, especially for a lot of these species, you do need a dedication beyond a single event, and definitely beyond a single growing season.
Right.
Okay. Let's see. Oh, this is a good one. So a few people are asking, how do we approach our neighbors who may have invasive species on their property and not know it, or who do know they're technically invasive but don't feel they're a problem? What are some good ways of engaging, doing that kind of outreach, and maybe even going beyond that, working with our neighbors to collaboratively remove some of these species from where our properties adjoin?
So I'm still struggling with that. There are some neighbors that have been extremely responsive and are so happy to find out, and to usually if I'm going to talk to someone about it, I always offer to assist. So if I'm going to ask them to remove something, then I'm very much like, can we work together? Can I help you with it? But then there are some that are resistant, and those ones are trickier, the ones that get defensive. And so it's hard to say, but in that case, just maybe setting the good example and then working with the other ones that are responsive, so that it becomes the norm on your street to remove these invasives and to include the non-natives. I feel like if they have pets or kids, it's easier, because then you can really like pull on their heartstrings and talk about how important it is for human health, and for even particular, like I know when we used to do work on herbicides and trying to get people off of the herbicides for their grass, if they were a dog owner and you mentioned that it was unhealthy for dogs, they were sold.
That's great. Great tips. I think also the offer of helping with the actual physical labor probably goes a long way. I know in my backyard, where we have Japanese knotweed and goutweed, the goutweed is mostly concentrated on my neighbor's side of the fence, but we'll often be there gardening together, not necessarily together, but at the same time, and we end up doing it together. Because we're both there, we're chatting, and then like, okay, let's do this. Let's deal with this goutweed. A follow-up question on the topic is, how do we approach government or garden centers or those horticultural sources of invasive species? So things that are already on the invasive species list or watch list, that you can still find in stores. You could still buy and bring back home.
So is the question, how do we advocate for a change in that?
Yeah. Any ideas? Any suggestions? I think we have an enthusiastic audience.
Yeah. Well, I would say please do advocate, and being part of so I'm not on the board of OIPC, Ontario Invasive Plant Council, but I'm a chairperson for the Horticulture Outreach Collaborative. And if you're interested in finding out about our work, because that's what we actually are doing more of like a carrot. So trying to work with the horticultural industry to make the changes. And we've heard from a number of growers that they aren't adverse to growing natives. It's just that they have systems in place for growing, say, Norway maples, that it will cost. So maybe it's a matter of looking at like, how can we decrease the barriers and increase the incentives of making those changes? And there's a lot of work to be done. The provincial legislation related to invasive species, the Invasive Species Act, is just gone through a review, and they're now talking about regulating a pathway. So I think it's going to be boating, recreation, but that kind of opens up the possibility to a regulating horticulture, because horticulture is such a big pathway for invasive plants. So if you want to advocate at the provincial level, it's the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, and take a look at the Invasive Species Act. Right now, all of these species that we talked about that are clearly invasive, the only one that is on the I think it's called the restricted or regulated list is dog-strangling vine. So Norway maple isn't on that, isn't part of the legislation, and the other ones aren't part of the legislation. So that has to change too.
So would writing, if these regulations are going under review at the moment or about to, We should be writing to our MPPs as well.
So I think the review period is over for this particular review, but definitely you could write your MPP, and then if you feel comfortable going to your nursery or your big box store and trying to get it's hard because they're massive and it's hard to find out who does the buying, but if you have a nursery, you could take this to them, and you could also ask Ontario Vista Plant Council to provide you with a bunch. We used to provide them to nurseries. We had a nursery outreach program, but we haven't done that in a few years. But we found that putting those out on the counters of nurseries and then having signs encouraging people to choose the non-invasive alternatives was helpful. So we'd love to do that again, but we currently don't have the funding for that.
Okay, well, that's good to know. If anyone out there has sources of funding or know where to find them, we could direct them to this very worthy initiative. So a note from last week's webinar's presenter, Sandra Pella, saying that for many invasive species, including goutweed, garlic mustard, dog-strangling vine, repetition is critical. It takes more than one round over several years, generally 2 to 3, to remove the weeds from your property. And they've had great success with cutting back methods on dog-strangling vine along a garden at TBG. And that method was to cut it almost to ground level and repeat that until the plant is starved to death, which is what I've started doing with goutweed at my place, actually. Apparently with goutweed, when you pull it, you stimulate root growth. And I found this out the day after I spent 2 hours pulling out goutweed. So don't make my mistake.
Well, like I said, we used to do all these garlic mustard pulls because it feels so satisfying to have a pile of garlic mustard, but we probably did more damage than good. And everybody probably went home with thousands of seeds on their boots. So now more and more we're encouraging people just to do the cutting.
So this one is interesting. So you've talked about covering up an area that you've just removed weeds from, invasive species from. Have you had an experience solarizing? So using that clear plastic and basically stimulating the germination of the seed bank, but then having that heat trapped, you end up killing all of those germinating seeds. Have you tried that?
I haven't tried that, no. I've tried the covering. I'm doing that right now on a patch of periwinkle. I actually just used some boards, but I have heard that I've heard people use that method. I'm sorry, I don't know how successful it is or not.
I haven't tried it either, but I'd like to try it next season, actually. I have a garden in mind, but yeah, it does mean a whole season's worth of plastic tarping over your flower bed. I think it's worth it. I think it's worth it. But a little pain for long-term gain. A lot of the comments in the Q&A box are thanks to you, Colleen, and saying how great the presentation was, and I would like to echo that. Thank you so much for sharing your tremendous knowledge and experience with these invasive species, pointing us to so many great resources that are available out there. And thank you so much for leaving us on such a high note with a really fleshed out, realistic and possible vision for how to create a more biodiverse, sustainable, beautiful, and healthy world. And I'm so pleased that you're in Project Swallowtail and actually making that happen at this very moment.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I'll just mention again that I do have some hard copies of resources that I'm going to leave on my porch. If you don't get too scared by the Halloween decorations, you're welcome to come pick them up. So that's 30 Galley Avenue.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. And I'll just end. Oh, here's Colleen again. You can also contact her at admin@projectswallowtail.ca. And note that we have another webinar, the 4th in our series, not next week, but the one after, with Ryan. Oops, sorry, I missed a letter in Ryan's name. Ryan Godfrey from WWF Canada, a good friend of Project Swallowtail, an excellent botanist and a wonderful person, who will be telling us about community stewardship and how to participate in data collection and monitoring projects to contribute to scientific research. And for everyone, of course, I invite you to visit projectswallowtail.ca, where we don't have them yet, but we will have all the webinars available soon. They're currently on the Pollinator Partnership YouTube channel, so you can look at that too. And there's also the Project Swallowtail Facebook group that I invite you to join. And you can always reach me at kl@pollinator.org. I'd be happy to answer any questions or point you in the direction of any of the resources that have been mentioned here tonight and others. So thank you very much, and until next time, good night.